Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Dr. Brian Evans. Brian is an ornithologist at the Smithsonian National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. Hi, Brian. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thanks for talking with us today.
Hi, Shannon. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so looking forward to this conversation because I really think it's going to be very educational. And as many of our listeners already know, a couple of months ago, a mysterious illness that affects songbirds started popping up in parts of the eastern U.S. And there are lots of people really investigating this disease in every state that it has been found. But one of the things that really drew me to you is because you're looking at it at more of a regional level. And I know our audience spans multiple states. So I thought that might be a little bit more applicable to more of us, is having that broader perspective on it. But also, one of the things I really want to talk about, in addition to the illness itself, is a little bit about that behind the scenes research and what goes into trying to figure out what in the world is going on with one of these emerging infectious diseases. Because for those of us who aren't directly involved with it, with the research itself, if you haven't done stuff like this or been involved in some way with this, it can get really frustrating because you don't know what's happening and you don't see all that behind the scenes. So I think that's really important too. But before we get into all of that, I want to take a few minutes and just have you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Shannon. Well, I'm an ornithologist at the Migratory Bird Center, which is a part of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and National Zoo. And my work focuses on the population and community ecology of songbirds. And most specifically, I study backyard birds, birds that we experience in our backyards throughout the eastern United States. And I study the way that bird populations and communities respond to habitats and environments in these backyard settings. And our goal is really to determine how we can best conserve bird species overall. And we look at these common species for clues to how they respond to the environment. And this is really going to help us solve some of the mystery of what's happening to birds through the early part of the 21st century and the latter half of the 20th century, because we know many bird populations are declining.
That's interesting. We may have to talk about other things later on the podcast, because I mean, that sounds like it would fit right in with some of the other, the whole idea of this podcast.
Yeah.
But focusing on the topic for today, I want to start off this whole thing by reminding everyone that there is a lot that we don't know about this illness. In fact, what we don't know far outweighs what we do know. And that can be frustrating, like I said before. And it's frustrating for everyone involved, the researchers, as well as those of us who are just trying to keep track of what's going on and learn about it that way. But at the same time, that's pretty typical of any emerging infectious disease and what's going on with it. So we'll talk more about that side of things in a few minutes. But I want to start out with, let's just talk about the basics of what we know or think we know about this illness and what's going on with it, because this is an emerging illness. This is science. And oftentimes in science, especially with things that we're just beginning to study, we find out later on that what we thought we know isn't quite right or isn't true all the time or has lots of exceptions to it. And we end up changing things because that's science. But let's get started with just the basics. When was this thing first observed and where has it been found?
Well, we first really started to pay attention to this mortality event probably in mid-May overall. And I can give you some of my personal experience with it, that I wrote it off Through May, I was reading social media reports. My partner was sending me social media reports of bird deaths throughout our region. And I'm here just outside of Washington, D.C. So we call that the DMV region, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. So we were seeing lots of reports coming out about birds dying. And my thought was, as an ornithologist, a lot of birds die. And it's the season, it's nesting season, its fledglings are coming out. It's no real surprise that birds are being observed dead. And I thought to myself, we're just out of COVID. Well, we're not quite out of COVID yet, but last year everyone was stuck home during COVID, and a lot of people got into birds. A lot of people got into observing the birds in their yards. And then this year comes around and we start to notice the birds that we've been observing last year in our yards. There's a lot of dead ones. And so frankly, in terms of ignoring the problem, I ignored the problem through most of May. And I had 5 dead birds in my yard that are among the species that have been affected by this mortality event. And I had blamed the crows. I have a lot of crows that live in my neighborhood, and I blame the crows for taking out a bunch of fledglings, even though many of the fledglings that I saw didn't have any of the symptoms of being taken out by crows. They were fully intact specimens. And this turned around for me when my neighbor Rita came over to my garden as I was in my front garden gardening and described a bird that she saw. And this was on May 27th or 28th at this point, described a bird that she saw. And she described the symptoms really spectacularly, that the bird was sort of looking confused, shaking a little bit, not really responding to her, and obviously blind. So those sets of symptoms really lit a spark in my head to say that there's in fact something different about this than what I'm used to. And I've been studying birds in Washington, D.C. since 2006 through banding, through observing nests. Something is different. And literally within a half an hour, I'd gotten a text message from one of our technicians out in the field with a picture of one of these injured birds as well. And then another neighbor came up that same day, within moments, with a bird, fledgling grackle, I believe, that was in really rough shape. And we took that bird to our local rehab center, which is City Wildlife in Washington, D.C. And they communicated to me at that point that this is a major event, that this is no social media hoax. And that it switched my thinking. What Jim, the president of City Wildlife, had described to me was that they've seen an increase of cases about 30 or 40% above the baseline levels at City Wildlife. That's a strong increase. It's important to keep in mind that we don't know whether this is going to have a population level effect on the birds. If we have 30 or 40% of the birds dying or falling ill because of this event, if those birds are birds that were compromised in their immune system anyways, then it may not actually have a long-term impact on populations. So while I say this is a major event, statistically, it's a major event in terms of the number of deaths relative to the average number of deaths that occur in the spring. But it may not be a major event long-term in terms of the populations, and we won't know that for quite some time.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one of the frustrations. And at this point, I'm guessing, I mean, those questions are obviously on the radar, but there's other questions taking priority right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's other questions taking priority. And it's something I think that's really important that I've personally talked to some ornithologists and some pathologists who believe this is no big deal. because it's mostly fledglings. It's not all fledglings, but because it's mostly fledglings. And then I've talked to others, including myself, who do believe that this is something that we should be really concerned about. But no matter what, whether this has a long-term effect on a population or just a short-term effect or even no effect on the population size, we still have to respond to it appropriately. We still have to respond by taking conservation measures, and we still have to know what's causing this. Mm-hmm. Because whether it's, we call this the question of whether the deaths actually have a long-term impact on the population, we would call that additive mortality. Additive mortality is basically when birds who would otherwise live start dying, and then birds that wouldn't otherwise live, we call that compensatory mortality, which doesn't have necessarily a long-term impact on the population. And that question, like you said, really is a secondary question to the cause, to the distribution of the event in terms of spatially and over time, and to what we can do as people, as community members, to address the event, to ensure that it doesn't have a long-term impact on populations.
Yes, because misaddressed, something that wouldn't have had a long-term impact could potentially, just because things add up, have that longer term impact. And I'm also, it kind of makes me feel a little bit better too, to hear that someone like you kind of ignored it a little bit to start with and was like, well, birds die. And it's that kind of, because when I first started hearing about it, I kind of did the same thing. I was like, yeah, birds die. It's that time of the year. And I kind of had the same reasoning that you did. And then as more and more stuff came out, I was like, oh yeah, no, this has the potential to be something important, and we need to figure out what it is and how to deal with it too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So where all has it been found?
It's a tough question, which seems crazy for me to say that, but it's a tough question. Because we can't definitively say what represents a bird that's part of this mortality event or not, directly answering where it's been found is almost impossible. What I can tell you is where it appears to have been found. Initially, it was isolated to the DMV region, to Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland, especially Maryland close to D.C., not along the Eastern Shore. Over time, we've seen these cases broaden in distribution, including Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, New Jersey, and Delaware. And that is the region that is specifically considered to be affected by this mortality event. Mm-hmm. Now, it may extend well beyond that. I've talked to researchers in Florida, and I've talked to researchers in Texas who've been observing the same thing with the same set of species. But it's not considered to be part of the affected region yet. Granted, the affected region may actually contract as we learn more about it as well. Those cases may be something else entirely. We don't know, mm-hmm. but we're gathering clues to get a sense of what the impacted area is spatially. But certainly those mid-Atlantic states and the Eastern Midwest are considered to be part of the impacted region.
Yeah. And I'm guessing at this point, based on what you said, I would assume that we don't know if the disease is or the illness or whatever it is that's causing this is spreading per se, or if we're just noticing it and paying attention and recognizing it in more areas, because those are two very, very different things.
Absolutely. There's at this point, there's no way to be able to disentangle the idea of a condition like this, an event like this spreading versus more people becoming aware and submitting reports of dead birds that may or may not be associated with this event. And I will say, as far as the birds that have been submitted by the public, and we certainly want the public to submit all of their observations, but the majority of those have been deemed to not be a part of the event. Roughly 70% have been deemed to not be a part of the event via different reporting systems. But the question was in regards to spread. And so in terms of spread, we could think of a couple different scenarios by which something like this could spread. The most likely scenario in terms of spread itself, if spread is physically occurring, would be an infectious disease that's spreading. We don't know if it's an infectious disease or not. So that's why we can't really disentangle more people making observations versus an infectious disease versus a physical means of spreading. One of the causes of observed spread may be because of the timing of the breeding season itself. So specifically, the time of year that nesting occurs is going to be earlier in the southern regions and later in the northern regions. So if this event is mostly influencing fledgling birds and nestling birds for that matter, then it might appear to be spread just because that timeline of the breeding season itself is moving north.
And this all just shows how complicated the whole situation is, and kind of underlines some of the things I'm sure we'll talk about more in a little bit about how research like this starts, which starts with recognizing that there's a problem, and that can sometimes take a little, I mean, we don't just instantaneously go, there's a problem. It takes a bit. And then, like you said, things are offset and regionally, and there's a lot into this.
Yeah. And, that recognizing there's a problem, it's interesting, at least from my perspective and how that developed, my perspective and my experience with this, in talking to the rehab centers in our region, in the DMV region, especially City Wildlife in DC, it was really them who sounded the initial alarm. And it was the fact that the cases moved above baseline. And then it went from moving above baseline to, in fact, overwhelming their systems. At one point, when I had talked to City Wildlife, they'd reached their cap of their ability to store birds because so many birds had been brought in. And those rehab centers basically had to coordinate with each other to say, hey, are other folks also being overwhelmed? We've got so many birds coming into our system. And that network, to my knowledge, that network is the group that said, oh, something's going on. Time to sound the alarm.
Which again just shows how important everyone in every aspect is when it comes to studying anything like this.
Yeah, from the people that find an injured or dead bird, or injured bird especially, and bring it to a rehab center, to every vet in the rehab system, to the pathologists and researchers at the USGS who are really leading this effort. Every single step in that chain is necessary, both in terms of recognizing that something's going on and searching for a solution.
Right. And it's going to take all of that to continue, especially if we start to try and figure out what's the range of this, even that.
Yeah. Just to answer that question, it takes incredible public interest and public reporting of what they're seeing. It really highlights the importance of anybody who's outside gardening or just walking their dog or in their yard, of making observations and sending those observations on. We wouldn't know that an event was occurring if that were not to happen.
Right.
And I've talked to so many people at this point that were in a situation like me, that they found 5 birds, 10 birds, even more, dead in their yards or in their neighborhoods before they actually did anything about it, or they found 5 birds or 10 birds and didn't end up reporting it to anyone. The number of deaths is also another question that we have. It's also something that's not known. But what we do know is that the number of birds reported likely represents a very small fraction of the number of birds that have been affected. But the more the public gets engaged, the more we'll be able to have a sense of that number.
Right. So what are the symptoms that we should be looking for?
Yeah, so there's 2 sets of symptoms. So there's neurologic symptoms, so symptoms of the brain or nervous system in many of the birds. And those symptoms might be shaking, especially shaking of the head. It could be an inability to stand. So the bird may be sort of listed to the side. They might be unable to stand or might be able to stand in a sort of straight up way. Or they might just seem really confused. And for the birds that I've personally observed, I would say that we're used to birds being responsive to us. We're used to birds flying away when we approach them. Probably one of the easiest tells that something neurologic is going on with a bird or that a bird is really problematically sick is if the bird doesn't fly away when you approach it. And that is the case with a lot of these neurologic birds. Then the other set of symptoms is what's called ophthalmic symptoms or symptoms of the eyes. And those symptoms, their eyes could be really, really swollen. So that's sort of a strange thing to observe. And I've observed it in a couple birds now where they really protrude from the head because the tissue around their eyes is really swollen. More often, though, they could be crusted shut or just have crusting on them, conjunctivitis on those eyelids.
Okay.
But it does appear for those ophthalmic birds, for the birds with issues with the eyes, it does appear several of the birds have been blind as well. So it's not just the eyelids, but it has impacted some of their abilities to see.
And this is more with younger birds rather than full adults, but has been seen in full adults as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's something that has been misreported by a lot of folks, unfortunately, not necessarily in the media as much as in the social media. I've seen a lot of people say, no, this is just something affecting young birds. It's not the case. It's predominantly affecting young birds. From the numbers I've seen, it looks like probably 90% or more of the cases are associated with young birds, but there are a proportion of adults that are impacted as well.
So what species are being affected by this? Are we seeing it in all species or just a few?
Well, certainly more than a few. And in terms of the species that we can say are impacted, the majority are common grackle, blue jay, European starling, American robin, and actually house sparrow I've seen a lot of cases of as well. Gray catbird, there's been a lot of cases. Now, at least in the data from public reporting systems that I've seen, there are a lot of species that are impacted. It's, again, one of those rumors that have either potentially been in just the media or the social media that only a few species have been affected. And I would say that certainly does not seem to be the case based on what I've seen as far as the birds that have come in with this set of symptoms. It is perhaps not unexpected when these are birds predominantly been brought into rehabbers from people finding these birds in their homes and their neighborhoods, that the birds that we're experiencing as a part of this event are those common backyard birds. Mm-hmm. Because those are the birds that we interact with the most. It's just a numbers game. So we don't really know what other birds may be impacted. That's actually, the species list is maybe surprisingly one of the unknowns here.
Yeah, and that's important to understand on many different levels too, is that I mean, yes, we may see these more in some of these ones that are more commonly found in urban backyard type settings because it was found first or first noticed, recognized, questioned, however
Yeah,
we want to phrase that, in the DC metro area. So obviously that's what's going to be found. But to
absolutely.
recognize that it's being found in other species as well is really important, because otherwise it's very easy for those of us who have exposure to lots of other types of birds or in other areas to say, oh, that can't be whatever we're talking about because it's not the right species, and to just
Yeah,
write it off. And that goes into that whole other question of observing and making these reports and not doing what we both did and so many other people did at the very beginning and saying birds die. It's a sad
yeah,
fact of life, but that's what happens, and writing it off when, wait a minute, this could be something else.
yeah, absolutely. That this could be something else. We have to have it in our mind really at all times with this. There's a phrase that maybe is secretly used among the birding community that I don't like, called trash birds. And, if we want to see our Blackburnian warblers and there's a bunch of house sparrows popping around in a tree, they become our trash birds that are just sort of getting in the way of what we're trying to observe. And I've seen lots of talk that, well, it's happening in starlings or it's happening in house sparrows. Who cares? Common grackles, we've got tons of common grackles around here. Big deal, right? But if it's happening, and this is true with backyard birds in general, if we're seeing something happen in our backyard birds that's associated with some environmental change or could be associated with an infectious disease, that's something that could impact your Blackburnian warblers, your black-throated blue warblers. And our first clue that something is happening is usually within our neighborhoods itself,
Mm-hmm.
that are filled with so-called trash birds, right? I don't
Right.
consider them trash birds, just to be clear. To me, they will always be glorious birds, as Maud said. But it's important that these common birds could give us clues for things that's happening in the environment. And though we hear the most of this narrow set of species that are being impacted, we shouldn't assume that represents the actual species being impacted.
Right. And the other thing that I find really concerning with the list of species, both the ones that are commonly reported and some of those others that you added on there as being seen as well, those are all different families. That means
Yeah.
this is a pretty broad ranging, whatever it is. I mean, we don't know right now whether to call it an infection, a disease, whatever this mortality event is, it's affecting a lot of different types of birds.
Yeah. And to me, it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild that it's not just that the event is affecting a lot of birds, it's that it's affecting a diversity of birds in terms of their genetic history or their phylogeny.
Mm-hmm.
We might not expect, not that we know that it's a disease, but if it's a disease, we might not expect that it would be able to reach across these diverse sets of taxa, of species.
Right. So I know there's been some hypotheses out there for what's causing this. My understanding is that most of that has been ruled out because at this stage of the game, that's where we're at. It's not, oh, look, let's test for something we don't know about, because we can't test for something we don't know about. But
Yeah.
it's all about, okay, let's rule out what we know about and go from there. But can you summarize what some of those are? Because even though some of them have been ruled out, I keep hearing some of them proposed and talked about. So let's talk about some of them.
Yeah, give me an example, because I'm curious as what you're getting at.
Well, just any and all of them, really. But I know cicada, I mean, this has been the cicada year for the periodical. So that's one that I've heard a lot. Also, some of the traditional suspects, I would say, on bird diseases, West Nile, avian pox, bird flu, all those. Yeah, there's been a lot of them, but
Yeah, so I would have to say, so it's really challenging. I personally got hit in the media pretty hard for putting forward our cicada hypotheses. So the cicada hypotheses developed for a couple of reasons. So one, I was personally researching in the DMV area with a colleague at James Madison University and a colleague at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. We were studying the influence of cicada noise on birdsong. So we were out in the field a lot, looking at the cicadas, being surrounded by the cicadas, recording cicada songs. I have about 21 automated sound recorders spread across the DMV region that's pulling bird song and cicada noise. And we're going to analyze all these data to see if birds are able to shift their pitch in response to the cicadas. So this is the backdrop. That was everything that was on my mind at that period of time. I was doing the cicada study and observing birds' response to the cicadas. We have a grad student at George Mason University where his job specifically was to observe behavioral response of the birds to the cicadas. So we're all out there looking, and what we're seeing really blew my mind. I've not been in one of these Brood 10 events before in my life. And the degree to which there was a wholesale shift in the diet of the birds in our area to cicadas was mind-blowing. It was really mind-blowing to see birds that aren't aerial insectivores, that don't forage in the air hunting for insects normally, all of a sudden are doing these amazing aerial insectivore maneuvers to catch cicada in mid-flight. You know, these are birds that glean off leaves typically or eat from the ground, but here they are doing maneuvers like they're flycatchers. Wild. Granted, cicadas are very sloppy flyers, and it probably helped them do it. But to see really a community of birds wholesale shift their diet to cicadas blew my mind. And I talked to a buddy of mine who runs a birdseed store out in Virginia. And he said, oh man, our sales are down. Like their sales went way down on seed, on suet, on everything. And the reason why was because they all stopped eating birdseed. It was an all-you-can-eat cicada buffet that surrounded them. So even before I was really aware of the mortality event or had taken it seriously, at least, I had been asking myself the question, what does a shift in diet like that mean? What does a shift in diet? You know, these birds, one of the things that's most remarkable about this 17-year cycle and birds sort of association with it is that these birds are behaviorally and evolutionarily naive to the cicadas. Any memories of the cicadas from 17 years prior would be basically wiped out of the birds themselves. So they have this naive food source that they love insects. So they're like, I don't know what it is, but it's an insect, so I'm going to eat it, right? Or a naive response to a food source, I should say. And we would expect on some level that there would be an implication associated with a shift of diet like that. And so we were basically already developing potential hypotheses when we started to get word of this event occurring, or when we started to take it seriously. And the Mesospora fungus, which is a fungus that infects the cicadas, is certainly the most fun of those ideas. It's a zombie fungus. I strongly recommend that folks read on the Mesospora fungus. It has a toxin in it that's called cathinone that has hallucinogenic properties on the cicadas themselves. So that became one of our hypotheses. But there's other hypotheses that developed as well. So for example, the cicadas spent 17 years underground, and we know we've created an environment that's often fairly toxic for the wildlife that's in it. And for the insects that are in this environment, feeding off of things like phloem from trees, they're exposed to all the toxins we put down, whether it's heavy metal toxins, whether it's chemicals that we might use for various home cleaning, whether it's pesticides, all of these things go into the environment. They go somewhere in the environment. So to think of these cicadas being able to accumulate what we call bioaccumulation of these toxins over the period of 17 years, we don't know whether that occurred or not, but the possibility, the mechanism is there for that to occur. And because you have birds that really switched to cicadas as far as a diet and just ate tons and tons of cicadas, the mechanism's also there for what we call biomagnification of the toxin. That as you go from sort of one group of animals that feed off of trees to another group of animals that feed off of those animals, that the toxins can get more concentrated. So that was certainly a large set of our hypotheses as we were looking at the cicada event were associated with that. And this is, again, even before really bringing in this potential for bird mortality, we were asking the question of how those cicada would impact the birds. When the event started to occur, what we were able to notice was that the distribution of the cases appeared to match the distribution of the cicadas. So we use community science data from the iNaturalist program to get a sense of what the cicada distributions were. And we used data from city wildlife in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding counties to get a sense of where these early bird mortalities were reported, where these were coming in. And they matched pretty well. And the timing matched pretty well as well. So you had asked earlier about when it started, and I think I bunted a little bit on that question to say, well, we really started noticing it in May. Well, it does appear that there were cases well before May, including April and potentially even late March. And what I've seen a lot is people saying, well, this is well before the cicadas. That's not necessarily the case. I observed as early as April, I believe mid-April, birds actually finding the cicadas while they were still trying to come out of the ground, well before emergence. We're talking a month before emergence in our area. I was observing birds feeding on cicadas. So that's pretty important that the timing, at least when we were really looking into that cicada hypothesis, the timing and the spatial distribution really seemed to match the cicadas rather well. Mm-hmm. The challenge is that was early in the learning process. And it was just a set of hypotheses. We never really thought the cicadas did it, or we never thought it was the Mesospora, or we never went to, any certainty whatsoever. We just recognize the mechanisms, and that makes it a valid question to scientifically explore.
Right.
Especially when there's a correlation observed with these two phenomena, with the bird mortality event phenomenon and with the brood 10 cicada. Mm-hmm. As time went on, what we found was that the spatial distributions, while largely matching, don't fully match. And most problematically, that the mortalities are occurring and have been occurring in areas where no brood 10 emergence happened.
Right.
And that does not knock the cicada hypotheses away. I should say that. It just makes them increasingly less likely. To me as a scientist, it's all about likelihood. And the likelihood has been going down for these cicada hypotheses to actually be potential explanations for what's going on in the system. It doesn't mean that they're ridiculous. It doesn't mean that, nope, we were wrong. It just means that the likelihood that we were right is very low. Right?
Yes, and that's something that's important to understand, especially for people who aren't scientists, is that you've really got to start with all the questions and just see which ones, investigate them and see how likely they are. And you're going to be, your likelihood of not being perfectly correct is a whole lot higher than your likelihood of absolutely getting it.
Yeah.
And yeah, when I first started hearing the cicada hypotheses at that point, I was like, yeah, I could see how that could work in a lot of ways. And then, like you said, as more information started coming out, and I'm further down the pipeline than you are because I'm getting it from different media sources and stuff. But yeah, I was like, okay, yeah, that, like you, okay, that's less likely to be the major causal effect or problem.
And I think with that, it's such a good point that the number of hypotheses has to be broad in addressing something like this. It's all of the potential things that could cause an event, and we have to come in to an event like this with that mindset that it could be nearly anything that makes mechanistic sense. And that's what we'd explore. Certainly, we wouldn't just explore one hypothesis. That would be bad science no matter what, right? We're going to explore the host of them at one time. And that's what the labs around the country, especially the National Wildlife Health Center, that's what those labs are addressing, is every potential cause. And I'll say, as an ecologist, I'm a population ecologist. I study how birds respond to the environment. I'm going to ask questions and address questions in a way that's going to be different than someone who's a pathologist, who's going to go through all of the potential things that the bird could be carrying, let's say in terms of disease or in terms of the toxic effect of some chemical, and addressing that. As an ecologist, my question is always, what's changed about the environment, or what could it be about this organism's environment that could be impacting the bird? So we're addressing the same things, but from different directions. And frankly, I think I personally trust the pathologist side a lot more, because they're methodically going through each potential cause and ruling it out. But I know there's a lot of frustration that we don't know what the cause is, that we've got all these hypotheses, and then we get word on the things that they say that it's not. And many people are really frustrated, especially because they've been asked to take their feeders down. It's not going to be a fast process. We don't know what the cause of it is. So as an example, if I was sick and went to the doctor, they would diagnose my illness and they would say, you have XYZ. If your wildlife that's a part of a larger mortality event, their role isn't just to diagnose an individual to see why that individual died or what infectious disease that they may have. They've got to see what's common across all of the individuals that we believe are part of this mortality event, which in this case includes many different regions, many different species, and finding that common condition is what has not occurred that would allow us to say in some way that this event is caused by XYZ. We've had a lot of conditions that have been observed in the birds that were not consistent across samples. So it suggests that they are not likely the driving cause of what's being observed. And that may include infectious diseases, it may include pesticides, but what's important is if it's not consistent across the samples, then we can't really say that this is what's causing the event. I assure everybody out there that's listening that the testing is ongoing, that the top labs in the country are doing this testing to really search for a cause for the event. They are testing everything that could plausibly influence these birds' health. There's just no definitive answer yet.
Yeah.
It's all about testing hypotheses.
Right. And it's important too to recognize that there is a diversity of people and backgrounds working on this. So you have the pathologist that can say, okay, we know about avian pox, we know about bird flu, we know about blah, 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 blah. And they can test very specifically for those things against the wide range of birds that have samples have been sent in and say, okay, it's not. Then we have other people like you with the more ecology background who are looking at the bigger environmental changes and saying, okay, this happened. Could it be? And looking and testing some of those hypotheses. And it's harder to do because on some of these, like you said, there isn't a test that you can do to find out, did they all eat brood 10 cicadas? It's kind of that causal and relationship and correlation at that point. And that's can be misleading. So you really have to approach it from all these different angles and look at it. And that's part of what takes time. And I'm sure every ornithologist, ecologist, lab technician, anybody involved with this, I mean, we get involved in these fields because we love it and we love wildlife. And whether that's some other taxa or specifically in this case, birds or whatever, we don't want to see these mortality events. We would all love to be able to snap our fingers and have the answers, but we don't. So it's just as frustrating for you all as it is for the rest of us who are just kind of sitting here waiting, go, come on, tell me what's going on? What's going on? What can we do to help? And it's frustrating to everybody.
Yeah. And I think I want to make sure that folks know that I fully empathize with that frustration. I was there probably a month ago, pulling my own hair out, trying to say, why don't we know more about this? And it just takes taking a step back and recognizing that this is the process that it takes to solve a situation like this. And I think that I would like to emphasize science moves slowly, but conservation doesn't have to and shouldn't, in fact. So we recognize that it could be caused by an infectious disease or caused by a toxin. If it's caused by an infectious disease, frankly, it doesn't matter where you are in the Eastern United States. Some folks have said, we haven't found a bird here in my state XYZ, why should I take my feeder down? If it's caused by an infectious disease, we all want to keep our feeders down. Doesn't matter whether you're in New York or in Maryland and sort of the epicenter of where this is occurring, or Virginia, the epicenter of where this is occurring. You have to keep your feeder down if this is an infectious disease, because conservation doesn't have to wait for a cause. And if it's caused by an infectious disease, feeding birds is just about the worst thing that we could possibly do, because birds achieve abnormally high densities around bird feeders. And we have a responsibility, if we love feeding birds, which I personally feed birds, not right now, but I do as well. But we have a responsibility to keep our feeders really clean, to wash them with a 10% bleach solution. But understand that now is for the sake of conserving these bird species, if we love the birds that we're seeing in our yards, we need to keep our bird feeders down. And I know that there are some states that are not recommending that action currently. I hold nothing against any group that is not recommending that. I totally understand. But personally, from my position at the Migratory Bird Center, I would suggest everybody keep it down until we know if it's an infectious disease. I mean, this wouldn't be the first time we've seen an infectious disease spread through a mechanism like feeding birds. We saw it with the house finch through the 1990s and early 2000s. The house finch population was truly decimated by a disease that they passed around at the bird feeder called Mycoplasma gallisepticum that caused conjunctivitis in their eyes. We don't have to facilitate the spread of diseases, right? Like COVID, we can take actions that reduce the rate of spread. And when it comes to birds, we sure can. We sure can take those actions. As much as we love the birds, love seeing them at our feeder, we need to respond appropriately. So conservation doesn't have to move at the same pace of the science. And we can be frustrated that we don't have those scientific answers yet, but we still have to respond appropriately. And I would argue the same thing about environmental toxins in general, that what a great moment in time to make sure that our own gardens are in order, let's say, that we know what we're putting on our gardens to do anything, to control weeds, to control mosquitoes, to control agricultural pests. Like it's a great moment in time to say, hey, wait a second, this could potentially be caused by actions like that. Maybe I should really think about what I put in the environment. We don't know if it's a pesticide. We don't know if it's a toxin in general. We don't know if it's an infectious disease, but we know the types of actions that we can take as people. And we know the types of policies that we can go and ask for of our politicians and our local wildlife resources agencies. We know those steps that we could take if it's either of those things. And if it's not one of those things now, chances are it's going to be in the future. So this is a good time to hit the reset button with how we interact with nature around us.
Yeah, because there's so many things that we can do that may or may not help, but they could help, and they're certainly not going to hurt.
They're not going to hurt. Yeah.
And I mean, even with science moving slowly, we've only really recognized this as being an issue for 2 months at this point. We're recording this at the end of July, 1st of August, 2021. Even just what I know and what I've heard and read, science is moving pretty quickly.
Yeah,
for scientific pace, I mean, it's moving pretty quickly for what we do know or think we know, or know probably isn't an answer, which is actually in science an answer, or at least a temporary answer. But we've learned quite a bit. It's that other side, that application side, that, I mean, it does take a while and it's hard for everyone.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point, that science is actually moving pretty quickly right now. You know, these things take a while to figure out by our perspective on the ground when we're ready to stick our bird feeder back out in our yard. But in terms of the amount of attention this has gotten from the scientific community, the amount of testing that this is getting, the amount of things that they've ruled out so far, that's quite a bit. That's quite a bit. It's quite quick. And I have to say that the collaboration that I've been able to observe has been remarkable between these state agencies, between the federal agencies, between the universities, with the Smithsonian, with the rehab agencies. Like, such a great system has developed to address this. And of course, all under the leadership of the National Wildlife Health Center. But it really says that with the appropriate attention, we can build the infrastructure to address problems like this in the future in a super targeted way, recognizing the fact that it is impressive what everyone has done, right? That infrastructure existed already because of the fact that they were able to respond as fast as they have. But it really shows how that network can be improved. For example, developing a national mortality reporting system. It's something that I know various groups have had as an idea for quite a while. There's been some reporting systems out there in place. DBIRD comes to mind, which is a super neat reporting system out of Audubon in New York. And I really think DBIRD has real hopes for being a strong national reporting system. It takes people hearing about it, for one. Currently, I'll say with DBIRD, I wasn't able to lean on it in order to get a better sense of the mortalities that are occurring nationwide, because there's more regional focuses as far as where people are submitting information from. It didn't seem like there was enough folks in the DMV region submitting to DBIRD to really use it to get a better understanding of the mortality event.
So we've talked about reporting a little bit here, and I know you've got a project going on. Can you tell us a little bit more about, one, your research and what you're doing, and two, how to report some of this information?
Yeah, so let's start with the reporting part. I want to wax philosophical for just a second, that one of the challenges that we face when we study ecology, when we study natural systems, is we always have to ask ourselves how we know something and really address the assumptions of what we know. And data gathering is really challenging in natural systems because we have to ensure that we're not missing things because of our own biases. So with this mortality event, probably one of the most challenging things is when I've gotten questions on it, what folks want to know, and you would ask these questions as well, what's the spatial distribution? What's the timing of the event? How many birds are affected, right? Those are three big questions. And they're, they should be super easy, right? They should be T-ball questions, right? The ball has been set up for us to answer that question. Just give me a number, buddy, right? Mm-hmm. But the deal is, we don't know that because the mechanism isn't in place for us to be able to truly address the answer to the question. We don't have the observational skills, in a sense, to be able to get a sense of the distribution, to be able to get a sense of even the species infected. I gave you more unknowns than knowns, for sure. Here's another guy saying, basically, we don't know anything, but we can tackle some of those unknowns and start to address those unknowns with community buy-in, right? The more eyes we have in the ground, with community science, going out there, people looking in their yards, people searching their parks, we can start to get a sense of what the distribution is, the species distribution, spatial distribution, time distribution, number of birds affected, if people just report what they see. So that's why we developed an online reporting system that's national. And some locations had a fantastic reporting system in place already. And I would especially say Virginia's is really, really incredible. It's a great reporting system. That state is just amazing what they've done, but it's pretty uneven across the affected region. Some places have reporting systems. Some people have call-in lines, right? There's a lot of different systems in place. And I'm not knocking those call-in lines or other reporting systems. But if we need to have an unbound sense of what the distribution of this event is, and we need to be able to analyze data fast, then we need a reporting system in place that allows us to do that unbounded by local jurisdictions, right? And the benefit of our reporting system, I'd love for folks to go to our reporting system. Even if you submit to Virginia, please submit to our reporting system as well. The benefit of this is we created a reporting system that's very easy to analyze. So on a daily basis, I get a sense of how the distribution has changed. We created a reporting system that addresses are geocoded automatically, meaning we're able to determine the latitude and longitude of these locations. So we've got lots of countywide data, location-specific data that's coming in to say exactly where these things are happening, when they're happening, and they're really easy to analyze. So I can get real-time results of what's going on, which is exactly what we needed with COVID as well, right? We needed a system in place so we could get a real-time understanding of when COVID was spreading, where it was, and where people had to be especially careful. Same situation in this case. If we want our data to be useful, we need to have it unbound spatially and need to have it quickly analyzable. So that's what we developed to address the problem. And the other thing that I would say that's an advantage of our system is we're asking folks to report birds no matter what. So there are some systems out there asking folks just to report birds that they believe are part of this mortality event. We want folks to report birds for any reason, sick or dead birds specifically, but for any reason, if it was hit by a car, if it struck your window, we want to know if your cat ate it. We know cats probably are the largest direct source of mortality on birds throughout the United States. They probably kill more than 3 billion birds a year. It's pretty wild, or at least more than 1 billion birds a year. And if we want to get a sense of different sources of mortality, then this report is going to be the starting point for us to be able to address that. So we want this report to be used after the mortality event, but more importantly, we can use those reports that aren't associated with the symptoms with this event to get a sense of the spatial bias of our own survey instrument. So we know cats kill birds in DC, but I would also assume that cats kill birds in, let's say, Wisconsin, right? Mm-hmm. But if I have less cats being killed in Wisconsin by far than DC, then I know that I've got a spatial bias in my survey that's not actually representative of a spatial trend in the mortality event, but is rather representative of the bias of the survey. So reports that don't fit the symptomology will still be used to identify the bias of the survey and allow us to really get a sense of what the distribution of the event may be.
Now, with your system, which is looking at, like you said, not bound by any specific geopolitical boundaries, state lines, anything like that, looking at the broader picture, is that information being fed into the state's databases that it represents? And is the state databases being pulled into yours, or would we need to report both places?
Yeah, currently we would ask you to report both places. I've reached out to Virginia and Maryland to share our data with them, and DC as well. We're sort of in line already in terms of data sharing. We're going to have to figure out how to share data. Until that happens, we do ask folks to submit in both systems, just so we have a real-time sense of this. And then we're going to have to filter out a bunch of duplicate records once all of our data sharing is in place. Data sharing is something that we all should be doing, but is difficult to do, especially if you're working in these systems like government systems. I would love to just give people my data feed so they could go right to the website, pulled out all the data that they wanted anytime they wanted it, but it doesn't quite happen that way.
Yeah, data sharing's always a lot more complicated than you would think it would be until you try and do it, especially when you start going multiple agencies, multiple organizations. Yeah, it gets crazy. I know that from my own experiences. And I mean, again, that's needing to report at both places can be another place of frustration. But at this point, it's still so early on that all those systems and agreements and stuff haven't been set up yet. And so this is just one of those things where we need to be a little bit extra cautious and do a little bit of extra work, and it's going to help everybody and everything out in the end. It's just, we're in the early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I myself am surprised often on how slow things move until you're in it. And sometimes I'm surprised at how slow I move unless I'm in it. But, our reporting system went online on June 28th, and it went online remarkably fast. Mm-hmm. But it was more than a month to get it from the idea phase to the execution phase, to make sure we weren't redoing something that somebody else was doing, to see if there was any other tools out there that we could use at that period of time. A month is remarkably fast, but from the perspective of a person wanting to know what's happening with the event, you're like, oh boy, this is super slow, June 28th, I would argue in our region at least, was past the peak mortality associated with the event. We know that it's declining in most places. And in DC, it looks like probably the third week in June was the peak, and it declined super rapidly after that. So we missed the big part of the peak with our reporting form, which is really unfortunate, but it got out pretty fast considering what it is.
Yeah. And that brings up something that I'm guessing I already know the answers,
Mm-hmm.
but I kind of want to ask anyway, because you mentioned that it's declining. I'm assuming that we really, at this stage, because we missed that peak and because we are so early in it and are still learning so much, that we have no clue whether that's by a decrease in reporting or because since this affects mostly juveniles that are most susceptible, populations kind of aging out, and therefore it might pop up again next year when we've got more juveniles again, or if it's whatever's caused this is kind of run its course and it's going to disappear as quickly as it appeared, or something else. I mean, we really don't know what's driving that decline, do we?
Yeah, we don't know. And that was a great summary of like all the potential, right? Those would be hypotheses describing why we would observe a decline. Those are all valid hypotheses that we don't know. Are we out of the woods? I don't know what woods we were in the first place.
Exactly.
So yeah. The only one that I'm going to assume isn't the case of that list is decrease in reporting. And part of the reason why folks have done really good in terms of keeping those submissions going to our reporting system. And again, we can use those mortalities caused by other things like being killed by a cat to measure how responsive people are in our reporting system. Mm-hmm. That's one of the ways. And the other way is that the birds aren't coming into the rehabbers with this set of conditions. And I trust the rehabbers completely in terms of being able to diagnose this set. They're still getting birds in. They're just not getting the neurologic ophthalmic birds in to the same degree. So it does look like it's decreasing, but it's hard to say what that means. Birds live very seasonal lives. The more I've studied birds, the more I've recognized that the seasonality of their lives from a human perspective is almost hard to wrap our heads around. It's almost like to some degree they become sort of different individuals at each stage along the year that are, of course, impacted by what the individual did in the previous life stage. But that period of nesting season in May and June and what birds do during that period of their lives is way different to what birds do in mid and late summer. Mm-hmm. Behaviorally, they shift. Internally, they shift. Their hormones shift, right? Like different things are going on with birds at those periods in time, especially their diets shift. This wouldn't be on the annual cycle perspective, but from a nestling to adult, a lot of these birds that were eating cicadas or had a really cicada exclusive diet don't even eat that many insects outside of the nest, right? Mm-hmm. But when they're in the nest, they eat loads of insects. So if you think about this from the perspective of birds interact with their environment at different times of year and at different points of their lives in totally different ways, those ecological connections with their environment shift so much at those different phases that we can't say, oh, it looks like it's going down, so we're not going to have to worry about it right now, because who knows what's going to happen next May and June.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is that just the way they shift behaviorally and everything else and involved with their ecology. I was just thinking of getting older and wasn't even thinking about the whole ecological connections there, but you're right. I mean, that's more questions.
Yeah, they react to their environment in totally different ways and each other, right? Mm-hmm. So if you go out in the wintertime, you can see a bunch of cardinals hanging out, feeding off the same feeder, doing things in groups. You go in breeding season, and those cardinals for that period of 2 months are mortal enemies, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I mean, that they're almost two different creatures. They react to their environment in totally different ways at different times of year.
Right. And then, like you said, many of our birds that do come mostly to the feeders and eat mostly seeds and stuff. That's not the case during the nesting phase. I mean,
Yeah.
when they're juveniles, they are getting that very high protein insect diet.
Yeah.
And that insect diet can change some. I mean, this year in certain areas, it really changed, like you said, with the cicadas.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's still a very insect-based diet. So, oh boy, yeah, lots and lots of questions. This just keeps getting more and more complicated, which,
Yeah. It's pretty fun too.
yes,
I should talk about what we're doing as well.
yes.
So currently what we're doing, we collected samples from city wildlife of birds that are thought to be a part of this event, birds that are neurologic and ophthalmic. We've collected samples from Lights Out Baltimore, Lights Out DC, these programs that collect birds associated with window collisions. And through other rehab agencies, we're collecting these birds, and those become control samples with which we can test these birds that have the neurologic and ophthalmic conditions. And then we're also going out and banding and swabbing healthy birds through our program, Neighborhood Nest Watch at the Smithsonian, going to people's yards and in parks, swabbing healthy birds, and then we'll test those swabs as control samples. If these birds are healthy, how are these birds different from the birds that are assumed to be a part of this event? And all that testing is happening through a process called metagenomics testing at our Smithsonian Center for Conservation Genomics. So we've got a great postdoc there, and Rob Fleischer's the head of that lab and an amazing expert. He's an ornithologist as well and an expert on bird disease and testing bird disease through metagenomics. And they're going to be doing targeted sampling. They're going to be doing shotgun sampling. And they're going to be looking at the microbiomes of these healthy birds versus the sick birds to, again, really look for clues in terms of infectious disease or look for evidence in terms of infectious disease that might point us in a direction in terms of a possible cause. So that's really the goal, the possible cause. I will keep measuring the environment around me and around our sites and look at how that environment may be influencing the birds. But at this point now, my goal is to provide samples for our Center for Conservation Genomics, to provide samples for the National Wildlife Health Center and other labs that they can do the pathology testing and the genetic testing that's really going to get us closer to a cause.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And that's going to be very helpful too. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us before we wrap up? Because this has been very interesting and educational.
Just highlighting that community really plays a role. And that's probably what's most important for me, is that everybody recognizes that community plays a key role in coming up with an answer.
Yes.
Even if they feel like they're left out of the loop.
Yeah, we can all help out with this just by reporting. And that is so important. It's just to report what we see.
Yeah.
But yes, this has been very, very educational for me. I've learned a lot with it and have really enjoyed talking with you. I will have links to the Smithsonian page in the show notes, as well as links to whichever of the online reporting systems for the states that I can find as well.
Awesome.
For any of our listeners that want to go in and look that up. But yeah, thanks again and have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.
I really appreciate Brian taking the time to share not only what's currently known about this bird mortality event, but also some of what is happening behind the scenes to figure out what's causing it. Personally, I think understanding that is just as important as understanding anything about the event itself. Because let's face it, this isn't the first bird disease or mortality event to suddenly pop up, and it's probably not going to be the last. Things like this aren't restricted to just birds either. New diseases and other mortality events have been found in mammals and reptiles and amphibians and just about every other group of animals. But no matter what group of animals we're talking about or what new mortality event we're looking at, the basic concepts of going from recognizing that there is a problem to trying to figure out what in the world is causing that problem and what we can possibly do about it are very similar, at least in the broad picture. So I think having a basic understanding of what is going on behind the scenes and how we as individuals can help move the knowledge needle forward even just a little bit through reporting or other activities is important for all of us who love wildlife and nature. I also hope that having a better understanding of how the process works might help reduce some of the frustrations that I know many people are feeling. Those frustrations are understandable and, as you heard, are being felt by everyone involved, including the researchers themselves. But despite those frustrations, it is still important for us to be extra cautious, to put the bird's safety and health above our own desires, and to take those conservation actions that we know have the potential to be beneficial. I also encourage you to report what you're seeing to the Smithsonian's National Database, and if it's available in your area, to your individual state's reporting system. As you heard, the researchers and scientists need our help and rely on those reports to determine the answers to even the most basic questions about this event. There's just so much that we don't know, and the more data that the researchers have, the better chance they have of finding the answers that we all want to know. Before I wrap this up, I want to ask a favor of you. If you find value in the Backyard Ecology content, please consider joining our community of supporters. There are many ways you can support Backyard Ecology, both financially and non-financially. Learn more at www.backyardecology.net/join-us, or just visit the show notes to get the link. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.